Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, as we were preparing for this next interview, we realized something. We spent a lot of time talking about what it takes to be a good leader. There's certainly a lot of books out there about examples of strong leadership in business, history, and politics. But something we don't talk a lot about is bad leadership and the consequences of bad leadership that have been left unchecked. And Carol, that's the focus of Barbara Kellerman's new book. In fact, she's written quite a few books about bad leadership.
She has indeed. She is a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Center for Public Leadership, where she was also the founding executive director. She's the author of a new book, Bad to Worse, What Happens When the Bad Festers. She joins us from Westport, Connecticut. Barbara, so nice to have you here with us. Congratulations on the new book. You write a lot about leadership. Tell us about this book and bad leaders. I feel like everybody has a bad leader in their life, sometimes more than one. Why is it that we kind of acknowledge that, and what do we learn from that? I'm not saying anything about my present situation.
What do I need to know about this, Carol?
If you've worked in a workforce, come on, at some point in your life, you have a leader that you're like, not a great leader. Why is it good?
Well, we're not going to get personal here. Hi, Carol and Tim. First of all, thanks for having me. Second of all, Tim, you gave me the perfect introduction, because it is absolutely true that what I call the leadership industry, which is a very multi-billion-dollar industry, is replete, full of books on how to be a good leader, but virtually devoid entirely of how to stop a bad leader. So yes, I have focused in my life to some degree on bad leadership, not only on bad, but the most recent book, the one that's just out 5 minutes ago, is called Leadership from Bad to Worse, What Happens When Bad Festers. And it really is trying to alert people that, in effect, the sooner you deal with a bad leader, the sooner you address the problems that a bad leader inevitably invokes, the easier it's going to be and the better it's going to be. The longer you wait to try to end bad leadership, however you decide to go about it, the harder it's going to be. But in other words, it does go from bad to worse if left unchecked.
But that's kind of like anything if you leave it unchecked, right? If there's something that, I don't know if with my life, is like if there's something that you need to get off your chest, if there's something that you need to change in your life,
do it.
Do it, because the longer you take not to do it, the worse it gets. But the problem with that, Barbara, is that that's in our own control, right? And we're not always in control of leaders around us who we may not feel are doing the right thing.
That's exactly right. Again, Tim, you got it nailed. But in the book, apart from the fact that it's sometimes very difficult to upend a bad leader, we tend to think it's going to get better on its own. So we get saddled with political leaders, with corporate leaders. I don't have to tell the two of you about the problem of bad bosses, because it's online all the time. I'm sure you hear about it all the time. And we seem to fantasize, number one, that it'll get better of its own, that a bad leader, however defined, and we can go into that if we have time, however defined a bad leader is going to wake up one morning and say, oh my God, I've been bad. I really do need to get better. And we similarly fantasize that there's nothing we can do about it. But the book talks about things that we can do about it. So it's number one, an alert to bad leadership. Again, we can talk about how I use the word bad. And it's number two, to alert people to the possibility, not necessarily the probability, but the possibility of acting on it.
Barbara, let me ask you, does every good leader need to be a bad leader first?
Absolutely not. We have lots of examples of it. It's true that we have some examples of bad leaders who either self-correct because they realize they're not doing the best possible job, or they correct because somebody or something intervenes. And that's really what I'm talking about. If I can just say one more sentence, the way I define bad is along two axes. One is from ethical to unethical, and the other one is from effective to ineffective. So you can have a very effective leader who, however, is deeply unethical.
So maybe that's a good segue to get to
some bad
the
leaders.
Case studies, because the book centers around 4 different cases of bad leadership. 2 of them are political and 2 of them are in business leadership. I want to go to one in business that I think everybody's familiar with, and that is Elizabeth Holmes, the CEO of Theranos. And I looked up where she is right now. She's actually serving time as we speak.
I was going to say, I think she's in prison.
She is in prison. Talk to me about why you chose her as an example of somebody who's not a good leader.
Well,
I should note, in your view.
Yes, and I make very clear my own bias. For example, I make clear in the book that I'm a liberal Democrat. So one of the leaders in that I cover is China's Xi Jinping, and I make clear that I think he's a bad leader because he's deeply oppressive. So yes, by the way, I think it's a very important point that I think one of the reasons we don't talk about bad leaders is because views of who is a bad leader and who is a good one are so likely to differ. But I try very hard to invalidate it. I don't think that's a good reason for not taking on bad leadership full-throated, again, as early on in the process as possible. So I think Elizabeth Holmes is by far the best known to American audiences in the book. Most people are familiar with her story, which, however, doesn't make it any less interesting.
Well, wait, can I ask you something? Can I just jump in?
Yes.
Elizabeth Holmes, somebody that we all covered and everybody was enamored and everybody had a cover story or a big story on her. Is she a bad leader or was she fraud? And is there a distinction to be made?
I would argue, Carol, that there's not. I think you said the word fraud. I think a leader who is fraudulent is indeed bad. She's a case in point of somebody who ended up deeply unethical, and also her company collapsed. So you'd have to say there's no more effective an indicator of being ineffective than having your company collapse. But you raised a very important point. The press fell in love with this woman. By the way, the fact that she was a woman and a good-looking woman and an idiosyncratically appealing and attractive woman is not irrelevant to the story, which I make very clear in the book.
Can we, Tim and I were talking and planning for our discussion with you is we kind of want to throw some names at you if we may, because you've studied leadership, you've written so much about it. President Biden. And good leader, bad leader, why?
Carol, are you trying to nail me on live radio?
And I'll give you both. I'll give both President Biden and former President Trump. Good leaders, bad leaders.
Well, I don't name Biden in the book at all, but I do name Trump, and I will stick with one fact about him because it's so obvious and so indisputable and so at odds with the American character that I think it's really worth extracting. I do think he's bad in different ways, although I recognize that many in your audience no doubt disagree with that. But as I said earlier, I think we must take a stand on the leaders we have. And I will simply turn to point out his proclivity for lying, for fabricating, for fantasizing. We teach our kids in the house, and we like to think the people we deal with in everyday life are by and large truth tellers. Note I say by and large. All of us lie some of the time, but he lies a lot. And it is interesting to me that somehow he gets a pass on that with many Americans. So again, I don't think it's ethical for our public, our political leaders to lie as much. Again, I say as much because political leaders lie, but to lie as much as he does to the point of fantasy and fabrication, I'm not sure that's acceptable, and I'm not sure that in times past the American body politic would have tolerated it.
And to be fair, there's been a lot of legal action against the former president. Not our opinion, but there's also been legal cases to kind of really lay out some of his past activities. Okay,
we only have 10 seconds. 10 seconds for this last one. What about someone like Elon Musk?
I do mention him in the book. I mention him as complicated, good and bad. And by the way, I know 10 seconds left, but one of the many reasons this is so difficult to tackle is because humans are not widgets. They can be complicated and complex. And Musk is an indicator of a leader who is in some ways great and good, and in other ways awful and bad.
Yeah, two sides to that coin in a big way. No, I would say that many people would agree with you on that. Great stuff. So appreciate it. Barbara Kellerman, her new book, Leadership from Bad to Worse, What Happens When Bad Festers.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Businessweek. Check out what Bloomberg Opinions Beth Kowitt writes in her most recent column. And I quote, because sometimes it's just so good, you have to read right from it. A big, powerful organization with a carefully manufactured image gets embroiled in a conspiracy theory about one of its most beloved and valuable brand ambassadors. To try to quell the uproar, said organization takes to its social feeds. But when those posts turn out not to be the full story, the conspiracy mushrooms sparking even more intense scrutiny and mass intrigue.
Dun, dun, dun.
What do you think we're talking about?
We're talking about the Palace's crisis involving Kate Middleton. And it's kind of interesting, so interesting that it is among our most read stories on the Bloomberg. Who'd have thunk? I would have thunk, because
You've been wanting to do this since Monday, be honest.
What?
You were looking for the angle.
We've all been
You were like, how can we work this in?
How can we do it?
You called it Kate Gate. You called it Photogate.
Beth Kowitt is here. She is senior columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. She covers corporate America. She joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. I'm so glad, you tied, thread the needle so that we could do this story.
There's a business angle for everything.
Tell us about
there
the
really
bet.
Is.
But it is interesting. We all know about the firm, right? In terms of the royals that are over in the UK. It's amazing that they are in this predicament.
Right. I think that's the thing that's so shocking here, right? They're supposed to be very sophisticated. They have a massive PR apparatus. How did they get this so wrong? And I think that is where we can make the connection to business, right? They are a brand. They are the firm. So how can companies kind of look at this and say, we cannot make the same mistakes?
So what do you think was the moment where it kind of all unraveled here?
So yes, I do think there was a moment when sort of your casual, royal watcher became like crazy internet sleuth.
Yeah.
And I think that was the photo, right? Like if you hadn't been paying attention, that's when you started. And that's when,
That's totally true for me.
Right?
Like as soon as I heard about that, I was like Googling everything, watching the TikToks.
Right. You're watching the TikToks.
Yeah.
You're like trying to look at the photos to figure out what had been doctored. And it just raised so many more questions. And I think that's the thing.
And we have the photo up. Listen, it's the photo that's been seen around the world, to be fair. Every tabloid's been on it. We've all been on it. But it was interesting because they obviously put it out there to send a reassuring sign because everyone was like, kind of, where's Kate? Where's Kate? What's going on? We know there's surgery involved. We don't know all the details, but nonetheless, this was put out on Mother's Day in the UK, right? To kind of just say, hey, everything's okay. And then so quickly, it came undone.
Right. It spiraled out of control. People were like, what is going on with this picture? There's all these little details that have been edited. And I think what sort of even took it up a notch was they tweet after the fact, kind of maybe a couple days later, a day later, their handle tweeted out, apparently a direct message from Kate. I'm so sorry. Like a lot of amateur photographers, I dabble in, Photoshop basically. And it's just so hard to believe.
What's crazy, and forgive me if I know too much about this, but Kate is an accomplished photographer, and most of the shots that are sent out, I feel like shared with the public, are often photos that she takes. She has kind of a real I feel like control over this. Tina Brown, who's a royal watcher, she's a Brit, well known for when she was editor of Vanity Fair and more. I heard her on air talking about that this is an individual who's so meticulous. So to see her kind of come out and be like, oops, I made a mistake, it just doesn't fit with kind of who she is. Make the connection, though, in terms of brands who often make mistakes, the role of social media, like why this has kind of really caught your attention and how you think about it much more broadly and really for the Bloomberg audience.
Yeah, I think a lot of big institutions have lost trust, right? Business being one of them. And these organizations take to social media, to their social platforms, to have a direct relationship, to have a direct conversation with their consumer. And that can be a really good way to build and restore trust. But then when you mess it up, it just can really spiral out of control. This is a very sophisticated audience that will just parse everything you do. And if you make a mistake, they're going to be all over it.
This stuff happens all the time to different brands, and you write about some of them in your piece. Before we get to those, I want to just start with the idea of what can the firm do to recover from this, or at least how could they have handled it differently?
Yeah, I think the problem here is that they are really straddling two worlds, right? On the one hand, they've been really active in new media, social, we want to talk to you directly. And in this case, they've really defaulted to old ways of doing business, talking about private engagements and personal matters. And you kind of can't have it both ways. You can't talk to your audience when it's convenient for you. They want to hear from you all the time, and you have to make a choice. And I think that's a big part of the problem.
It's interesting going back to Tina Brown, who was on another network, one of the major networks, and she made the point of that the Queen in her, I guess, last 8 or 10 months, which I had no idea, apparently said she had a form of cancer, but she still at some point did some Zoom video, and that maybe something as simple as Kate going out on a Zoom and kind of addressing UK citizens directly might have just made everything go away and been a much easier, simpler way to kind of deal with all these concerns.
And the fact they haven't done that, I think, raises a lot of questions for people. Why have you not just done something like that to clear this up?
I mentioned that you talk about another company in your piece that had I don't want to call it a similar misstep, because it's hard to compare what's going on with the royal family to anyone.
I know. I was trying to think of examples. There's nothing that's quite parallel.
But when you are thinking about it from a brand perspective, it is absolutely parallel here. And I feel like that there are so many examples of companies making missteps. And you chose just one for this piece.
Yeah, and I wrote about this because this is a company I've covered in the past. And it's and I think you could probably look at a lot of direct-to-consumer brands and see examples of this. But this is a small brand called Daily Harvest. They're direct-to-consumer, vegetarian, vegan, frozen food company. And what happened was they really just capitalized off the Instagram era. That's how they built their audience. But then they had a food safety crisis, and they took too long to really talk to their consumer directly. And what happened was their customers filled that silence with their own theories, kind of critique of their failings. And I think that's the real risk here. You cannot, again, talk to them when it's convenient.
Beth, I mean, lots of companies get into trouble, and I think about, Chipotle for a long time, or Lululemon when it, the sheer, I don't know.
The Chip Wilson stuff.
Right, exactly. Like, there's lots of things. And what was interesting, I also thought about, like, using social media to address concerns versus maybe sometimes good old, I don't know, like, doing a Zoom, or I don't know what it is. Like, we need to think about, like, how brands communicate with consumers, because sometimes I feel like you throw something on social media, you think it's all done,
right? And
that isn't always a great way of communicating.
Yeah, I think
sometimes going back to some old-fashioned ways, whatever that may be, is better.
Right. I mean, I think we do think of. I mean, that's the thing, right? Social media for everybody is very much manufactured authenticity, right? It's like, oh, look how accessible we are, but we know that this is so performative in so many ways. Right. And I do think maybe having an interview with someone, talking directly to people, and just not kind of putting out something that's so polished all the time maybe helps a little bit.
I think the thing that's also different now is the way that you have these internet sleuths that are able to figure out what's going on. Because I would have looked at a picture like that and been like, fine. Yeah, it's a picture.
Like, what a nice family.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but I think about
Happy Mother's Day. Also didn't know Mother's Day in the UK was different than Mother's Day here. That's a big takeaway that I have.
It is.
That was a big takeaway.
But I think about, did you ever play those games like it's like two photos, like find the differences? I'm kind of obsessed with that. Yeah. And I go through and you think like, I don't see anything, and then all of a sudden you're like, or continuity, like in media. Like, have you ever done that? You're watching a show and you're like, wait a minute, that sweater, it's like different or something.
You sound like you're fun to watch movies with.
I'll do it all the time. But it is interesting, right? That the social media world is savvy and can say, wait, something's off. And it makes you think about brands need to be really wary of that, right? Yeah. I don't know. AI is going to make it all perfect, so what are we worried about?
I think that one guarantee we have, Carol, is that the story is going to continue.
Yeah, I think it's...
Until they say something.
It is like from where we started, that anything you've ever seen, The Crown or books written about royalty, the firm, like, they have such control that for them to be in this situation is pretty remarkable. It is a great lesson for anybody who's got some kind of company or institution or brand. That's really important.
Well, Beth Kowitt has absolutely figured it out. Senior columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, who worked a way to make a connection to business in the royal family. And we thank you.
Anytime.
We thank you for that.
Thank you.